Welcome to Not Another Podcast, where we cover the latest trends and research in online learning, educational technology, and instructional design. I'm your host, Brittany Robinson from notanotherbrittany.com. I'm an instructional experience designer, an e-learning strategist working at the intersection of education and technology. And I specialize in tech courses, coding boot camps, and software engineering apprenticeships for virtual, blended, and online learning experiences. Let's dive right into this week's topic, ADDIE versus LLAMA versus Agile. This week, I watched a powerful 2020 YouTube video called Navigate Ambiguity from Stanford University's D School. Now, when you remove ambiguity and experiential learning from your learning environment, you are removing the student's agency, and you're left with this binary where the student relies on the instructor to tell them. And we all know that telling isn't the same thing as teaching or training. Ambiguity, even though it's something that a lot of instructional designers try to avoid, can actually lead to design thinking and very creative work. As an instructional designer, you can imagine how this ambiguity might actually apply to theories like triarchic theory and generative learning, and actually motivating students by giving them more agency over their learning process and their own projects. Now, Stanford takes the approach of giving students multiple different requirements, and then they have the students determine on their own which ones are the most important. The instructors are still there to offer help and guidance, but without giving the students too many correct answers or giving them the entire plan for how to get from point A to point Z. So you can imagine it's still a very self-directed, independent learning process with sufficient support to make sure that the students are successful, but there's also a lot of intrinsic motivation involved in this learning experience. Now, on the flip side, I have actually worked for learning directors at the Fortune 500 level in corporate America who have been adamantly against ambiguity. And their argument is that if you have empathy as an instructional designer, if you put yourself in the learner's shoes, you understand that it's a very frustrating experience as a learner, and that ambiguity has the potential to lead to very poor outcomes. Now, that might be the case in some situations, but I would actually hypothesize that there's a certain balance that we need to strike as good instructional designers. We need to provide enough scaffolding and practice activities, potentially even active learning activities beforehand, so that our students and our learners can be successful. But avoiding ambiguity altogether and holding the student's hand throughout every learning experience, or trying to have 100% control as an instructional designer over that learning experience, is not doing our learners any favors. Speaking of ambiguity and design thinking, I've also been investigating the connections between ADDIE, Agile, LLAMA, and design thinking this week. Even just the overall flow of design thinking, where you empathize, then you define, ideate, prototype, and test, mirrors almost exactly the ADDIE stages of instructional design, where we analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And there's also overlaps between design thinking and Agile or LLAMA as well. Keep in mind that design thinking and Agile both focus on empathy as a first step. In design thinking, we use empathy when we ask the question, how might we? Whereas in Agile, we use empathy when we say, as a learner, I want to blank so that blank. Now, going back to ADDIE sometimes gets a bad rep because it's not agile. It's based upon a waterfall methodology. But the fact is that ADDIE is the original scientific, linear, and logical process for instructional design. ADDIE mirrors the design thinking approach, and in many ways, it mirrors the plan, do, study, act approach. And given that it dates all the way back to the rise of instructional design in the 1970s, it is also technically the foundation for SAM and LLAMA and the other instructional design methodologies that we use today. Now, speaking of LLAMA, for those who aren't familiar, LLAMA stands for the Lot-like Agile Management Approach for Instructional Design. Unlike ADDIE, which was developed by the United States government roughly 50 years ago, LLAMA is newer. It was developed just within the last 10 to 20 years. LLAMA was actually developed by Megan Torrance and is a registered trademark of Torrance Learning. And let me be clear, LLAMA is not 100% Agile. It even says in the name, it's a lot like Agile, but it's not exactly Agile. What Torrance Learning did was they took the government's ADDIE approach, which is traditionally very waterfall, and made it iterative so that it can be more easily applied in Agile working environments, like the ones that we typically experience in corporate America or at tech startups. At one point, Torrance Learning even offered a self-paced e-learning course on their website where you could learn LLAMA in a self-paced, self-directed online environment. Although, as of the date of this recording in September 2022, that course now redirects to the homepage and it no longer seems to be available. Regardless, I've been asked by previous employers to implement LLAMA as an instructional designer working in an Agile working environment. I've seen LLAMA in action at Fortune 500 companies based in Wisconsin or Michigan, which makes total sense because Torrance Learning is also based in Michigan. LLAMA is pretty similar to the iterative approach that I use in my own personal instructional design work. Even when I'm working with a traditional ADDIE methodology, I don't try to save evaluation for the end. Instead, I will perform multiple rounds of iteration and evaluation and feedback. And then in between, I take that evaluation and that feedback and I apply it to the next rounds of design and development. And you just keep repeating that process over and over until you get the result that you're looking for. So it kind of looks like this: analysis, then design and development, then implementation and evaluation, then repeat your design and development, then more implementation and evaluation. You just repeat that over and over, iteratively, as many times as you need. So in practice, you are creating a very usable first draft, then you're getting feedback on that draft, then you're adjusting and presenting a second draft, getting feedback on the second draft, and then adjusting again. And you just rinse and repeat, do that over and over. For example, imagine that you work for a university that's trying to improve the learner experience, increase enrollments, and reduce dropout rates. Let's say that you've conducted analysis and research and you have your data points and now you're ready to start ideating solutions. Start with empathy, the key skill that we all need to be successful instructional designers. So you might ask questions like, who is my audience? What are their pain points? How might I solve those pain points? Really put yourself in the learner's shoes. So your initial ideation on this type of a project might include solutions like reducing the number of live sessions, making live sessions optional, recording those sessions so that your learners can watch later. Now, let's say that you implement these solutions and then you conduct a round of evaluation and then you receive feedback where someone informs you that there's already a scholarly research article out there that was published in Social Behavior and Personality, an international journal, in 2021, Volume 49, Issue 8. The title of the article is Antecedents and Consequences of College Student Satisfaction with Online Learning. And in this article, the researchers In and A. Zhang proposed that antecedents leading to online learning students dropping out of college included, and I quote, interactions, teaching presence, self-management of learning, and academic self-efficacy. The consequences would be, quote, the intention to continue to use online learning. Now, this study, which involved about 236 college students, was published in 2021, making it incredibly recent and relevant during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, here's what those findings suggest. Students' satisfaction with online learning is equated and positively related to the interactions between students and instructors, between the teaching presence, the self-management of learning, and the academic self-efficacy. The student satisfaction with online learning also was correlated to a positive prediction in the student's intention to continue to use online learning. And the researchers came to the following conclusion. Educators should find ways to increase student satisfaction, especially in those online learning courses. And there's also a need for increased knowledge among educators of this correlation between student satisfaction and students' intention to continue online learning. So based on this information, you might actually adjust your initial idea and create a second draft that you implement, and then conduct another round of evaluation and feedback. Then you'll keep rinsing and repeating. That is the process in action. Now, let's address the title of this podcast, which, yes, it was inspired by my favorite TLC song, Don't Go Chasing Waterfalls. There's this tenacious argument that we hear so often in the instructional design industry that we should move completely away from ADDIE because it's not agile enough or it's too waterfall. But listen, that is not realistic for every single project, and it's not a good fit for every single client. Sure, there are some clients in some situations where you absolutely should use a more agile process, and maybe LLAMA or SAM might be a better fit for certain projects. But there's also this pressure to, as Mark Zuckerberg would put it, fail faster or test throughout the entire process instead of at the end. And what I would like to say here is that some industries actually should stay ADDIE or stay waterfall because there's such a high risk of harm, doing harm to other people, doing harm to the product or to the end user if you do things too fast or if things start to slip through the cracks. Examples of these industries are the government, the military, the healthcare field, the legal field, and even some universities. And sometimes the client or the subject matter expert might not have the time or the capacity to review several iterations of the same project or to provide feedback multiple times. For instance, I once worked with the state of California back in 2016 on a massive instructional design project for the correction industry's healthcare system. An agile or iterative approach was discussed, but we ultimately decided against it, and it was a pretty unanimous decision among 20 or so instructional designers. And the reason why we decided not to go with that approach was because we can't pull our subject matter experts, our lawyers, out of trial or interrupt our neurosurgeons during surgery just to have them provide feedback or to hop into meetings with us to discuss something. Now, remember, your subject matter experts' time is valuable, and what looks good on paper or in theory might not be the best solution to apply in a real-life scenario. In some instances, traditional ADDIE really does make the most sense, so be strategic. Compare and contrast between all of your different options. Choose the one that works best for you, for your client, and for your situation. Now, if you're not familiar with ADDIE or with waterfall methodology versus Agile, this podcast may not have made the most sense to you. So here's a resource for you to watch after you get done listening here. Jason Clark, who is the president of VIA Studio in Louisville, Kentucky, USA, created a 2015 YouTube video called Art, Copy, Code, the Agile Edition, which does an excellent job of explaining the differences between waterfall versus Agile methodology. I highly recommend giving that a watch and checking out the other resources by VIA Studio as well. They do not disappoint. Well, hopefully this information sparks some ideas that you can immediately apply to your own instructional design process. That's all I have for you for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week as we unpack learning experience design.